Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. So we talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Ross Jaffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. The Alabama Crimson Tide just beat out the North Carolina Tar Heels for a massive transfer portal center addition. And that player is none other than Clifford Omoruyi, the former Rutgers center. He has committed to the Alabama Crimson Tide. I'm going to go over how massive of an addition this is for Alabama and what the Crimson Tide's roster is looking like for next season. Now, we know that Alabama basketball, ever since Nate Oats has become the head coach, has been a much better basketball program. Alabama is a football school, and they probably always will be for the amount of success that they've had in college football, but Alabama basketball is no joke now. When Avery Johnson got fired a few years ago, and their best player that they had back then was Colin Sexton, they really struggled to even make the NCAA tournament, but now they're making the NCAA tournament every single year, basically, and they're even making deep runs in the tournament. This past year, Nate Oats got Alabama all the way to the Final Four, and that was Alabama's first ever trip to the Final Four, and it took a win over North Carolina in the Sweet 16 to help Alabama get to that Final Four, and now they've just knocked off UNC when it comes to a massive transfer portal recruitment, because I thought Clifford Omoruyi was going to the North Carolina Tar Heels. I thought Oumar Ballo was going to the North Carolina Tar Heels, but Oumar Ballo ended up going to Indiana, and a lot of people believe that Indiana ended up somehow outbidding North Carolina for Oumar Ballo, which I don't really know how that's possible, because yes, North Carolina has a lot of NIL, but there are rumors that Ballo got over $1 million to go to Indiana basketball, so it's like, okay, that makes sense. But then Clifford Omoruyi, Alabama, we know they got a lot of money, but they put most of that money into football, but they are putting more of their money into basketball now that Nate Oats has that program cooking. But North Carolina is still North Carolina. And Joe Tipton tweeted out that he was told this morning that Cliff received a $2 million NIL offer from a school while going through the portal process, and it was not from Alabama. That school is unnamed. But the other schools that Clifford Omoruyi was considering was North Carolina, Georgetown, and Kansas State. Where do you think that $2 million NIL offer came from? It had to be North Carolina, and the Tar Heels did not land him. And North Carolina desperately needs a center because Armando Bacot is gone. He's out of eligibility, so they have a gaping hole at that spot. I'm sure North Carolina is going to end up with a pretty solid center for next season, but losing out on Oumar Ballo and Clifford Omoruyi are massive losses, and whoever they end up landing in the transfer portal in the coming days probably isn't going to be as good of a player as those two, but only time will tell. But Alabama, this is a huge transfer portal win, and it's not the only great addition Alabama has made this offseason so far. They've made a lot of great moves. Nate Oats is on fire when it comes to recruiting, whether it's high school or whether it is transfer portal recruiting, and he had to have a lot of success because Alabama is losing a lot of players from this past season's team. Looking at their projected scholarship chart right now, they have 11 spots out of 13 filled, but if they hadn't have added all these players so far in the offseason, they would have had tons of roster holes still, because look at all the players they lost in the transfer portal. Now, obviously, not all of these players were important. Somebody like Muhammad Wagee did not play too much this past season for Alabama, but other guys like Rylan Griffin, who transferred to Kansas, or even Sam Walters, who transferred to Michigan, he had a lot of potential. Rylan Griffin had a good season this past year for Alabama, so those were tough losses. Even Nick Pringle was starting to come around toward the end of the season. He was playing pretty well, but he's leaving, and Alabama needed a center also. So you could say Clifford Omoruyi chose Alabama because they have a lot of playing time available and they needed a starting center, but so did North Carolina. But again, they got denied, and Alabama ended up picking them up. And the players that Alabama has on their roster as of right now, they have LeBaron Fillon, who was a former Kansas commit, but he decommitted, and now he's going to Alabama. He's a talented player. Aden Holloway, the former Auburn guard, he's transferred to Alabama. So we've had two players this offseason transfer to their arch rivals. Roddy Gale Jr. went from Ohio State to Michigan, and Aden Holloway left Bruce Pearl for Nate Oats. It's a tough loss for Auburn. Losing a really good player off your team's bad enough, but him going to your arch rival is even worse. Latrell Wrightsell Jr. looks like he's coming back for Alabama, and the Crimson Tide have also brought in Chris Youngblood, the former guard from South Florida. He averaged 15 points per game this past season, and Nate Oats has had a lot of success with players coming up from smaller schools, so we'll have to see how he does. Nas Cunningham is a talented player coming into the program. He's a 4-star small forward in the 2024 class. Then you also have Mohamed Diabate. He's coming back. It looks like he had more potential than Muhammad Wagi, so we'll see if he can improve next season for Alabama. Darian Reed's on the roster. Grant Nelson's back. A lot of people thought he might leave, but he's a guy that could have ended up maybe testing the NBA draft waters, but he also kind of struggled a little bit from three this past season, and if he can get better shooting the basketball from outside next season, he still could have a shot in the NBA. Aiden Sherrill is another player from the talented 2024 high school recruiting class, and then Clifford Omoruyi is there to round out the roster. And when I said Nate Oats was doing a fantastic job in recruiting, I meant it. Overall, Alabama has the number 2 recruiting class right now in college basketball, and they have the number 14th ranked transfer portal class. So they got a good blend of talented freshmen coming in and transfers as well, and some returning players. I feel like that is the perfect mix of players right now in college basketball. Being able to bring in guys that are talented freshmen, and maybe 1 or 2 of those guys will pan out. It's tougher for them to pan out than it was in the past because you have so many guys staying 3 and 4 years in college basketball. But usually if you bring in a couple of really talented freshmen, at least one of them is going to have a good freshman season. So Alabama has 4 really talented freshmen in Darian Reed, Aiden Sherrill, Nas Cunningham, and LeBaron Fallon. I think of those 4 guys, at least 2 of them are probably going to play well for Alabama next season. And heck, maybe all 4 of them will have a big role. But Alabama's got some really good players coming in through the portal. I think Cliff Omuruyi is going to be the starting center next season for Alabama. It's a massive loss for Rutgers. He was a really good player the last 4 years for the Scarlet Knights, but Rutgers, even though they're bringing in some talented freshmen next season, I guess he just wanted a change of scenery in his final year in college basketball. If you look at Cliff's shooting statistics this past season, he shot 51% from the field, 61% at the line, and 20% from 3. So every now and then he does attempt threes. It's definitely not a major part of his game, but it is good for Alabama that he is capable of knocking down a 3, even if it's rare. His field goal percentage, being a 6'11" player, is kind of average at 51%. You would like it to be a little bit higher, but the Big Ten is a very tough conference to get easy buckets, so that is a little bit excusable. And 61% at the line, he's not a great shooter, but he's also not the biggest liability in the world either. And Alabama's going to have other players that are good free throw shooters as well. And he averaged 10 points and 8 boards this past season for Rutgers. If he can keep up around the same points and rebounds per game next season for Alabama with all the other talent that they have, then he should be a big asset next season for Alabama. Aden Holloway, as already mentioned, is huge, stealing him from the Auburn Tigers. Chris Youngblood from South Florida. Houston Millette from Pepperdine is the other addition. I don't know if he's going to have a massive role next season for Alabama, but at the very least, he should be a bench player, and maybe he could end up surprising. Sometimes guys from those type of schools end up having a lot of success. And as I mentioned earlier, Alabama has 2 roster spots left, and potentially those roster spots could be filled by guys that have declared for the draft for Alabama that could return to college basketball next season. Jaron Stevenson, he was a freshman this past season for Alabama. He's definitely a guy that I think that should come back to college basketball. He also could have transferred as well, but he is not in the portal. He's either going to go pro or come back to Bama, but he has enough potential that I could see him going off to the NBA, even though he didn't put up a lot of points this past season. But I think Stevenson should come back to Alabama like Noah Clowney did, improve as a sophomore, and possibly get drafted even higher, but we'll have to see what he does. It will be tough for him in a loaded front court next season for Bama to get a lot of playing time, but still, if you want to be an NBA player, you got to show you belong by improving in college basketball. And then the other player for Alabama is Mark Sears. He's a different story because he's been in college basketball for 4 years. He has 1 year of eligibility left, and I don't know how much more he can improve. It might be best for him to just go off to the NBA, see if he can find a way to latch onto a roster, because if he comes back to Alabama, I don't really think there's much else that he can do to be able to showcase where the NBA would possibly draft him next season if they don't draft him this year. But we'll have to see what Mark Sears does. If he comes back, Alabama is absolutely loaded for next season, and they possibly could be one of the favorites to win the national title next season in college basketball. But as is, they have a really good roster for next season with a great mix of guys from the high school level, returning players, and transfer portal prospects. I don't know if Alabama is a top 5 to 10 team in college basketball, but they're definitely a top 15 to 20 team. And with a couple of other solid additions, or those players in Mark Sears and Jaron Stevenson returning, I think Alabama could be one of the best teams in college basketball next season, and possibly a top 2 or 3 team in the SEC. The Crimson Tide are looking like they're here to stay in college basketball. They're going to continue to showcase that they're not just a football school. And to be able to land a guy like Clifford Omoruyi over the North Carolina Tar Heels shows how far Nate Oats has brought the Alabama Crimson Tide. And it looks like he's going to keep on bringing in talent to Tuscaloosa to help continue to make Alabama a great team in college basketball. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below about Clifford Omoruyi committing to the Alabama Crimson Tide over the North Carolina Tar Heels, the Georgetown Hoyas, and the Kansas State Wildcats, and whether you are surprised he picked Alabama over North Carolina, and whether you believe that Nate Oats has done a fantastic job or not of bringing in great players through the transfer portal and high school recruiting, and if you think that Alabama is going to be one of the best teams in college basketball again next season. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.